All right, welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening science seminar series put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus here in Nome and University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant, and you're in the home office tonight.
Yep.
So both Alaska Sea Grant and Northwest Campus, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and Central Yupik peoples. Now tonight, if this isn't a straight science talk, I don't know what is. We've got Bella Block. She is a graduate student at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and she's calling tonight from Anchorage. So you're on our time zone. We've had a couple lately that have been a little bit out of our time zone, so we appreciate you. And she is getting her master's, or she's in the Master's of Public Policy program at University of Alaska Anchorage. And what better topic for us tonight than hearing about vessel traffic in the Bering Strait region? This is the topic that is extremely of interest to everyone living here. Everyone is being has seen the results of our sea ice loss, and honestly, the results of bigger and better ships that are able to handle the sea ice and are coming throughout the year. So with that, we are all really interested, Bella, in what you have to tell us about the increasing rates of vessel traffic in the Bering Strait region and our policy options. Take it away. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks for that introduction. So yeah, as Gay said, my name is Bella. I'm at the University of Alaska Anchorage, specifically within the Institute of Social and Economic Research. And I will be graduating this weekend with my master's in public policy. And I've spent the last 2 years working on this topic of looking at increasing rates of vessel traffic in the Bering Strait and kind of management options and general trends that have emerged. Ooh, let's see. There we go. Okay, so I think most of us, pretty much all of us, are probably aware that the Arctic is heating up both environmentally as well as geopolitically, with a lot of major players such as Russia, China, Canada, and the United States. There's a lot of different natural resources that are available with less sea ice. There's also trading routes that are becoming available, lots more fishing, oil and gas, things like that. And so with that, there's a lot of geopolitical tensions across the Arctic and specifically within the Bering Strait, with trading routes and working through like these international waters. So let's see here. Okay, so this is a pretty recent study from the Arctic Council Protection of Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, looking at the polar coat area, which you can see in the map on the right, looking at the different amount of unique vessels through this area from 2013 to 2023. So we can see that there's like a pretty steady increase. So things are happening in the region. Very interesting. And so specifically on the Bering Strait, this area has been called the chokehold in the Arctic due to its very narrow strait there, about 50 miles across. So what I did here, just kind of to show the comparison of the whole Arctic to the Bering Strait, there's less traffic compared to like the whole Arctic, because again, we're looking at a little snapshot, but there still is that general increase of unique vessels going through the region. And the years on this one is slightly different than the Arctic Council one, but still shows that general increase. So one reason why increased vessel traffic is of high concern for a lot of people in the region is with the effect of wildlife and then therefore the people that depend on marine resources. So from the 2018 QUARIC report, I can totally link you guys in if you want to read the whole report. But this report looked at different subsistence areas of walrus and seals. And I wanted to compare these two maps on the left from the QUARIC report to vessel traffic on that I have access to. So I created this map on the right of different walrus and seal harvest areas and compare that to a heat map of vessel traffic. So we see the red areas is where there's highly dense amounts of vessel traffic through this time period. And then the blue is kind of less traffic, but it's still happening. So we can see that these areas are highly impacted and can continue to be impacted as vessel traffic increases. So this kind of leads me into, I'm going to do a brief overview of the project that I've been working on as a part of this larger project. This is the Arctic Telecoupling Project. It's an NSF funded project from 2020 to 2024. So we're in the wrapping up phase. And we wanted to focus on the Bering Strait region due to all of the stuff I just talked about. So the project goals for this is to understand the connections between different actors on the region, such as tourism, vessel traffic, resource extraction, and the influences they have on marine habitat that are crucial for subsistence economies and cultures in the area. Another project goal is to understand how these telecouplings affect the well-being of communities. So telecoupling is a very jargony word, but basically is looking at how these larger worldwide globalization influences can impact local communities. So kind of a little brief overview of each part of the project. So for the shipping aspect, we have marine mammal habitat suitability modeling. So looking at different areas where marine mammals might be moving towards with different actors such as like climate change, things like that. And then we have a graduate student who is on today, Sydney. She is looking at marine mammal and ship interaction. If you want to introduce yourself really fast, Sydney.
Hi everyone. I am the PhD student working with Bella. I won't take up too much of her time, but I can drop my email in the chat if anyone has any more direct questions related to that.
Perfect, thank you. And then what I've been working on with shipping is the effects of maritime activity via policy. So in the second leg of the project is looking at tourism. So I've been assisting Michelle, who is also on, as well as we had a previous graduate student, and we're really looking at things such as business surveys. So we looked, the previous graduate student did some business surveys in Nome during spring and summer 2023, just to see like just the different tourist catering businesses that are available. And then, like I said, I've been helping Michelle. I'll have her introduce herself in a second. But we've been looking at cruise passengers, visiting places like Nome, Seward, Anchorage, just to see like why they're doing the cruises they're doing, where they've traveled, things like that. So we did that this past summer, as well as hopefully planning on doing that next summer. So Michelle, if you want to give a brief introduction.
Everybody, my name is Michelle. I'm a PhD student at Michigan State. Like Bella said, we've been doing surveys up in Alaska, and I'm in the planning stages for data collection for this upcoming summer, but also be at Alaska Marine Science this the conference this upcoming January to share some of our results. So hand it back to you, Bella.
Thank you. Yeah, and so then another leg of the project was a previous graduate student who did the business surveys. He also was interested in resource development. So one of the big things was the Graphite 1 mine that is probably going to be happening outside of Nome. And here's a couple maps just showing like some of the impacts to sport fishing and subsistence in the area. And if you guys are interested, you can read his whole report. I'm not going to go too into depth on it because I'm not a mining person. Okay, so brief overview of everything that's been happening, the project I'm working on. So specifically now moving into what I have been studying the last 2 years. So effects to Bering Strait maritime activity via policy. So study region, as kind of we can tell it's the Bering Strait. So I just wanted to kind of familiarize you guys with a couple of different things, some general information, and then some specific policy designations that are currently in place in the region. So first we have Arctic trade routes. As I was mentioning, they're becoming more and more accessible due to lack of sea ice. So the first is the Northern Sea Route. It's the purple dashed line that goes over Russia. Yes. And then the Northwest Passage is the dashed magenta line that goes over over Alaska over towards Canada. So these are the two main routes right now. The third route, which is mainly hypothetical at the moment, but can potentially happen in the future, is the transpolar route. And this is the light pink dashed line. It goes straight across the Arctic Ocean. Right now, hypothetical because we don't have ice-free Arctic Ocean yet, but there are estimates that could be like as soon as 2027 that there will be ice-free Arctic Ocean. So another general idea is the exclusive economic zone, or an EEZ. This is the grayish dashed line around Alaska. And this is the United States EEZ, but the other part of the strait is Russian EEZ. So then moving on to some current maritime designations. These are put in place by the International Maritime Organization. These are areas to be avoided, which are the dashed red lines. Recommended routing measures, which if you go on the zoomed in map, it is the orangish line there. And then you have precautionary areas or precautionary measures. These are the little intersections of those routing measures, just like be super careful. There's lots of traffic going multiple directions there. And then the last thing that applies to the whole region is the Polar Code. This is a set of different regulations via like relating to shipbuilding, environment, things like that. So my study objective for my project was really to determine whether vessel traffic can be impacted and mitigated through different policies. So my research design, I won't get too technical, but it was a mixed method. So looking at hard data and then comparing that to qualitative data and quasi-experimental. So I don't have a complete experimental setup due to the nature of the project. The motive for this project was really to include community concerns. There's been literature for many years now about increasing vessel traffic in the area and how that might impact subsistence communities. So the data collection, I mainly relied on secondary data sets that were available to me through this Arctic telecoupling project. And then also attending workshops and interacting with the community as much as possible. So for my analysis, I really wanted to focus on the Bering Strait in Western Alaska, and I wanted to look at all the different vessel traffic types that are happening going through the region. So not really focusing on just cargo or just fishing. I wanted to look at everything, which is quite a bit. So the first thing to do to set up this study was to really look at what kind of data inputs I was going to be considering. So for qualitative, looking at community input, making sure that my study kind of aligns with what people in the community are experiencing. The second thing was to figure out how to quantify changes due to policy. So I relied on two different analysis methods, the first being hotspot analysis, and the second being a community summary. Obviously, I'll go into depth on those. So kind of an overview before I go into the specifics of each analysis type. Some key findings. So the first being locations of major traffic. There's a lot more on the Russian side right now. Russia is really trying to commercialize the use of the Northern Sea Route, as well as a lot of fishing in the Gulf of Anadyr. So a majority of the traffic is on the Russian side, which impacts policy deeply. The next thing was looking at community traffic. There's a lot of hubs and spots there, like Nome, Kotzebue, Red Dog Mine. You have a lot more traffic happening in those areas. So I wanted to also look at how often certain vessels are traveling the region and whether or not that affects how they're going to adhere to certain policies. So what I found was that it does actually impact how often vessels are adhering to, in particular, the areas to be avoided policy. So the third thing that I found overall is that areas to be avoided did change vessel behavior. And again, I'll go into that a little bit more later. And then the last thing for the major key findings is that local voices on shipping and subsistence do have a very big impact on research happening in the region. and can then shape local policy. So this is an example of my hotspot analysis. This is specifically for cargo and tanker vessels. And I have two maps here because I'm looking at this idea of transit intensity. So this is on the left, we can see vessels that are transiting every single year of my data set, which is 2015 to 2022. And looking specifically at how these vessels are reacting to this area to be avoided policy put in place by the IMO. So with all year traffic, so those are transiting every single year, we can really see a lot more traffic around Russia, which makes sense because this is cargo and tanker ships, as well as some traffic happening on the American side, but not nearly as much. And then we can see too that based on the statistical analysis that I did, there is a decrease in how often the vessels that are transiting every single year are going into those areas to be avoided. So overall, a good thing. So I did the process again for vessels that transited frequently, but not every single year. We had very similar results. Vessel traffic decreased in the areas to be avoided, which is good. And then we had a little bit more traffic happening in from Nome and on the western side in Alaska, with those hotspots being red. So I repeated the process for every single ship type. So the second one I wanted to point out was the tug traffic. We can see that there's a large behavior change from the policy implementation, which is interesting because the areas to be avoided policy only really applies to cargo and tanker traffic at the moment. So having an impact on these other vessels types is very interesting. So for the tug traffic, we had a decrease for the all year intensity of 18%, which is a pretty big change, as the vessels don't have to abide by this policy. And then again, for the middle frequent travel, but not every single year, there was a pretty big decrease of 26%. And a lot more tug traffic is happening on the US side. So for my other vessel type, this is vessels that are not categorized as anything else, or they're unknown, or just kind of a conglomeration of just random codes there. They just got all shoved into other. So this one was interesting because we had a lot more vessels, and a lot of vessels we don't know whether or not they're supposed to abide by the ATBA policy. But we did still see a decrease across the board for vessels that are transiting every year, as well as 4 to 7 years. So overall, very good. So the second thing I wanted to look at, in addition to this transit intensity, was whether or not going to communities impacted the vessel traffic. So I looked at cargo vessels in particular, with the idea that cargo traffic is going to be servicing communities the goods they need for the year. So I totaled up all these different trips across these 30 different communities and wanted to look at them seasonally. So late spring, summer, and fall. And we do see that there's some patterns that arise. The first kind of no-brainer, I guess, is that Nome experiences the most cargo vessel traffic in the region. This makes sense, being a hub village. Yeah, not super surprising, but still interesting, especially like this scale difference there. The second thing that kind of arose was more southern communities see larger rates of late spring cargo vessels visits. This can probably be attributed to lack of sea ice. So it'll be interesting to see how this changes as sea ice retreats, whether or not there will be a more even distribution across Western Alaska. And the last thing that I noticed was looking at these 3 communities that are placed within areas to be avoided. They don't receive very many visits at all. And so it's likely that they're probably serviced by tug vessels rather than cargo vessels. However, I do need to repeat this process with tug to confirm that. So looking at some community outlooks, I attended some workshops, went to the community of Nome a couple of times. And these are just things that repeated across the board every time that I was in the area, things that seem to be of importance. The first and foremost is subsistence, being able to access subsistence, the changes due to vessel traffic, decreasing numbers of harvestable animals, all very important. The second thing is the environment. As Gabe was telling me beforehand, Noma's been having rain and 40-degree weather in December, which is crazy. We've been having that in Anchorage, slightly less crazy, but still pretty bad. So the environment is changing drastically. And there's been an increase of harmful algal blooms in the region. There's been changes in migration patterns, and then overall just climate change. The next thing that's been kind of brought up quite often is this idea of development. So there's the Port of Nome expansion that is most likely going to go through. Probably early estimates are 2030. I'm not sure on the current status of everything with the Port of Nome, but that will likely increase vessel traffic even more. And then Gratville Wine Mine, as I kind of mentioned before, we had a graduate student working on that, but another area of development which can increase road traffic, vessel traffic, decrease access to subsistence, etc. Gold dredging is a concern for a lot of people in Nome, and then tourism. And then the last thing that I thought was interesting that people were concerned about was this lack of oversight and monitoring, just people not being placed in Nome to make sure that things are going to order. So taking all of this information, looking at how things have been impacted, vessel traffic has been impacted by current policies, looking at current community concerns, changes in the environment, things like that, and kind of shift towards a policy lens here. There's a big policy implication with my study and the overarching Arctic telecoupling project study. So for my part specifically, showing effectiveness in changing vessel traffic patterns can really lead to vessel and operator safety, increased subsistence access, and environmental protections. So for my master's degree, I came up with a couple of policy options. These are not exhaustive, and it's kind of a starting point, open up the discussion. So these are by far not the only options for the region, just the ones that I came up with. So the first is updating the regulations of these Bering Strait ATBAs. So instead of just targeting cargo and tanker vessels, include all vessel types, kind of reduce that traffic around these hazardous areas. The second option is implementing speed restricted zones. So this is based off of policies on the East Coast relating to right whales. So taking these speed restricted zones and putting them in places where subsistence is often happening or mammal haulouts are common, specifically in the Bering Strait. Another option is establishing a traffic monitoring system where vessels transiting the Bering Strait can sign up to get pertinent information such as whether or not there's subsistence activities happening, if people are seeing marine mammals, things like that. And then the last idea I had for a policy option was to extend boundaries of the current ATBAs, as well as implementing an ATBA around Little Diomede Island. So these are what I came up with, again, not exhaustive. So one thing that is interesting about the Bering Strait is that there's a lot of management considerations when it comes to policy. First and foremost is the political landscape. So Russia and the United States, there's a lot of geopolitical tensions there. A lot of things can't be applied to the entire Bering Strait, considering there's likely to not have any joint policy options at the moment. So the second thing to consider is the legality. So there's a whole host of state, federal, and international processes that have to occur relating to maritime activities. So being able to transcend all of those boundaries is a concern. And then the last thing is the feasibility. So would the policy be hard to implement? Would it be able to transcend monetary restrictions, political changes in power, things like that? So all of those things are very important to consider. And so kind of like what's next? Um, Obviously, there's a lot to still work on in the region. A lot of things to study, a lot of things for policy. So one of the things that I didn't look too much into currently, but am really interested in is the militarization of the Arctic and how that can really affect maritime activity and subsistence. Another thing that's really interesting right now is marine mammal and fishery conflicts as those fish stocks are moving north. Um, Things like with fishing nets and things impacting marine mammals. And then looking at if there's any sort of nexus between increased maritime activity and harmful algal blooms. So these are all just the tip of the iceberg on future study topics for the region and the Arctic as a whole. And so with that also, it's important to implement current policy options and then watch and analyze how those are affecting the region and adjust. So one quick shout out for a current policy, um, I guess not policy, but just a watch group is Arctic Watch. They're really trying to increase the ability for traffic monitoring in the region, having community access so that people are able to call in to Arctic Watch and say, hey, we're going out here, we see whales in this area, and relaying that information to vessels in the region. So that's a vessel traffic monitoring system that's slowly starting to get put in place. So seeing how Arctic Watch is impacting vessel traffic will be another really interesting way to prove the value of these different policies that kind of transect geopolitical tensions. And then finally, getting community input to um, continue working with the communities, making sure that things are being studied and policies are being put in place to protect the communities and working with the communities rather than doing research and leaving and not really caring about what happens in the region. So that is my presentation. I'll take any questions. Might be able to pass off questions to Sydney or Michelle. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bella. That was a good overview of everything kind of going on in the strait. And for straight science for the audience, before you come up with your questions, this is the time we put in the chat, show our speaker, Bella Block, a little love in the chat. It's never easy to be a public speaker. Speaking as one, and you always get the butterflies and whatnot. Very, very nice presentation that you provided. So, anybody have any questions? There you go. There's your audience coming in for it. Good job, Straight Science audience. Any questions right off the bat? Burning questions. I know I've got a burning question, and that is your last one was community input. And I always, because I'm a public servant, I always look at we have a lot of grant funded things that provide very good information, but we really lack services from the federal government and honestly for all the things that people in most locations take for granted. We don't really, I was telling Bella earlier, the two federal things that we have in the Bering Strait region, when you think about like all that she's talking about, the biggest federal entities we have is the FAA and the post office, and we're grateful for both of those, but for maritime issues, they're a little bit, could be better. So do you see, when you're doing your work, do you see there may be more federal or state interest in providing services, or is it going to be sort of more research driven or NGO driven, grant funded, that sort of thing? Do you see in there the agencies at all that might be more appropriate? Are they gearing up for dealing with Western and Northern Alaska and especially the Bering Strait region? We've got federal agencies that should be here for marine mammal activities and biology, subsistence activities, commercial fish activities, traffic, military, everybody should be up here. Do you
Yeah.
get that in all of when you're doing your good research?
Yeah, I think that's a really good thought process question mix
Okay,
you got there. Yeah, I want to say like with the Bering Strait, it's really interesting because you have this mix of you have local communities with the state of Alaska, and then you also have just right there Russia, and all of the international traffic that's happening.
tribal
And
government, sovereign tribal government. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and so I think like from my research, there's a lot of movement towards like NGOs that aren't government affiliated to try to kind of create these partnerships in ways that kind of leave government out of it because of the tensions between federal governments. Um, but I do think that there needs to be more federal government in Nome, especially with like the Nome Port of Nome expansion, marine mammals, everything you mentioned. There should be more, and it's I think also too something we were talking about before is just kind of this lack of communication. There's a lot of research happening. We're all finding our own different things. Not very much communication there, and then kind of a lack of communication between researchers and policy. Uh, People doing policy in federal government. So I think there's across the board just a lack of communication.
All right. Well, thank you very much. In the chat, you've got a question. Thanks, Bella. Can you describe the process to identify areas to be avoided? Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that
So,
is, why isn't Little Diomede kind of already an ATB, an area to be avoided, since they're sitting right there smack in the middle with Big
yeah.
Diomede?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. So the process for area to be avoided, they're across the world, like in oceans, obviously, um, and they're placed in areas where travel is hazardous. Is kind of like the main thing. So, if vessel operators and vessels are more likely to run aground, things like that, so shallower waters, they're placed there. And then there's also kind of the environmental component. Don't want to run aground and spill a whole bunch of oil. So there's kind of that criteria of is transit hazardous? Will it impact the environment? And so with the Bering Strait ATBAs, they were first proposed by the US Coast Guard during their port access route study. And they did suggest having an area to be avoided around Little Diomede due to its location and all of the traffic happening. Um, but they eventually decided against it due to it being more beneficial to have a joint ATBA with Russia and the United States around both Diomede Islands. And that just wasn't going to happen. So they kind of scrapped that. And they proposed the areas to be avoided, but they weren't picked up by the US Coast Guard. And then they eventually made its way into the IMO with their polar code. They adopted those. They thought it would be really important to protect the environment.
Does that answer? Okay, thank you. And you got a big thank you, Bella, for your response. Any other questions? You can raise your hand on the toolbar, or you can blurt out if you must. That would be me, because I'm never a good Zoom tool for knowing all the cool buttons, and I can't keep up with the updates. Or you can type it in the chat. There is a new chat. Okay, so Sydney Walverin is introducing herself again and leaving an email if people want to talk with her. I guess for the polar code, that sounds like a way we can make change. Is that right? Or bring awareness? Is that what I got out of your, am I off the mark there?
Um, Not 100%.
Not 100%. Okay.
Yeah, so the Polar Code is really it's the International Maritime Organization. They created a set of there's a whole bunch of different aspects to it, different regulations that apply to the idea of polar waters, so Antarctica and then the Arctic waters. And so the process for putting that into place took quite a bit. They're still trying to kind of update it and take into account increased traffic and the threat of pollution. There's a lot of talk there. And it's kind of a slow process because it's this international organization. They have to have, so many people sign on to it. Um, and yeah, so it's kind of, I would say, like, being able to change an international code is going to be a lot longer than like working with local NGOs and kind of bridging those gaps there.
I don't know if you're cheering me up, but it's good info to learn because I was thinking not just NGOs, but we have 20 tribes in the Bering Strait region that
Yeah.
are that are comprising of 16 coastal communities, and it's e- everything you mentioned is right on the money as far as impacts and things like that, and it would be nice if I just wondered how local people get their voice heard. So thank you for that. I didn't know if the polar code, we should go to the polar code. Jim Gamble, I see you, but Austin got to you first. So let's go to him in the chat and we'll get you second. Austin Amosic says the threat posed by increased shipping traffic, Port of Nome expansion, and the Graphite One mine is not just an environmental issue. It is a direct assault on his culture, food security, spirituality, and sovereignty, and poses a great risk to our people, place, and history. Vessels routinely seek and obtain exemptions for vessel safety, environmental regulations, or compliance. I am worried your research will be used against Indigenous communities since we are not complicit in global militarization or development. Any thoughts on that? Thank you, Austin.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Um, I wanted to frame my research without trying to take on the ideas and beliefs of the people in the region because I wasn't able to have a boots on the ground work for 2 years in the area as much as I would have loved to, as well as knowing that a lot of like harvest areas, subsistence areas, things like that are very touchy, especially working with like federal government funding, and didn't want to try to like put research together that could be used against the communities in the region. Um, yeah, so I do think it's interesting the point of having exemptions. I haven't really come across that too much, although again, I'm not boots on the ground in the area dealing with vessel traffic day in, day out. That would be a really interesting thing to look into though. So thank you for bringing that part up.
All right. And Jim, you got your hand raised. Go for it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Gay, and thanks, Bella. Terrific presentation, and I just wanted to remark on a couple of things. Your list of management options is literally the list we're working from at the IMO. Pacific Environment has consultative status at the IMO. So we're working many of these things from the IMO perspective, and also, of course, from the local Alaska regional perspective. And so I just want to give you credit for really identifying things that are not sort of esoteric imaginings. They are real work items that are really underway. So I wanted to mention that, and just to say that if you're interested sort of in the in the in the in the minutia of what's happening at the IMO and sort of the history behind it, and maybe some of that other information, it'd be great to chat with you about that, and maybe point you in some directions if you think that would be useful. Also want to say that Austin brings up such a good and important point. And one of the new developments that's come up quite recently is that Inuit Circumpolar Council is the first Indigenous organization to achieve consultative status at the IMO. And that is a groundbreaking thing for ICC to be able to sit at those tables behind their own flag, speaking with their own voice. And so that is something I think in terms of how policy might be influenced in the region, really important to take that into account. Both ICC at the sort of the larger international level, but you mentioned quite correctly that community voices can have a big influence on how these things happen, and so that is also a really great insight and a really important one to repeat. And so I guess just a kind of a question to close, and sorry for pontificating for so long, but I really am quite impressed. And that is, if you had to prioritize, from your perspective, if you had to prioritize one near-term measure, which one do you think it would be from your experience that you developed doing the project? I very interested to know. Thanks.
Well, first, thank you for all of the comments. I definitely try to not come up with these policy options, best world scenario, imaginative, trying to take like the here and now, what has been done. So that's really validating that there are things that are actually being worked on. And so I guess from my policy analysis with those policy options that I put in place, I feel like the best option right now, that is things that are currently going underway, is a vessel traffic monitoring system. They can be really impactful. I didn't really go into it in this presentation, but part of my work was looking at how the alternate planning criteria for the Aleutian chain requiring vessel traffic monitoring can be really influential in directing traffic out of these areas to be avoided. And so I think Arctic Watch is doing a great job of like starting that as an NGO, working with a lot of different NGOs, including Queric in the region. It was kind of like a first step of like, what can we do now without working through all these different channels of government? Ideally, I think I would love to see a area to be avoided around both the diamides. That's kind of big goal thinking there, like working with Russia. But at the bare minimum, putting one around Little Diomede. It's looking throughout all the different aspects of my research, all of the traffic that goes right by Diomede. It's crazy. And I think putting one in place there would be very, very influential in some of the impacts that the island is facing.
Hello.
Excuse me, Jim Gamble says that he completely agrees with both of those. Thanks, Bella. All right, I heard somebody.
Hi, Gay. It's me.
Hi, oh, go ahead, quick.
Hi. I think it's important to work with Diomede as well, because we may, I know for sure that shipping, increased shipping is big. Even though we don't see the vessels with our own eyes every day, a lot of that shipping is on the west side of the island. They're crossing every day. I do get the alerts on my email. And then there's of course the shipping on the other side. But then I just wanted to add that with your research that you're doing, I hope you are connecting directly with the community, the tribal community, about obtaining any information. Let's go back to last June when the Norseman 2 was stuck, stranded in the ice behind our island and about 10 miles off of Wells, was it? Gay might know that answer. But so anyways, that Norseman was stuck out there, and we heard of it from, I got a text message in my Facebook Messenger from somebody that knew the Norseman was stuck, and then so this Norseman contacted villages, but did not contact Diomede. This is the time, during that time, the guys out here were hunting for walrus, because Diomede started pretty late than all the other villages that were already hunting walrus, because our ice is always the last one to disappear. So the guys are hunting. Of course, our winds were bad that time, so good thing they weren't going to go out there and hunt while that Norseman was stuck. But anyways, so the Norseman did contact and obtained contact phone information from Queric, so that the Norsemen can talk directly with these tribal communities, but did not reach Diomede. I'll tell you why. Queric had outdated information, and it's even showed in the newspaper that time when the Norseman was stuck that they admitted trying to reach out to the villages, couldn't reach Diomede because nobody was responding. Well, you can't respond to old information. You can't respond because, you know, the tribal president that they were trying to reach out to was deceased.
Mm.
So that was super old information and they weren't able to connect with us. So I hope you gain your information directly from tribal communities and not from, you know, consortiums.
Mhm.
That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Definitely, like I was talking to Gay earlier before the presentation, that our project really wanted to go out to every single community or as many as we could. And then we started right in the middle of COVID. So things really shifted. And so trying to work as much as we can, like in parallel and in conjunction with larger consortium, such as Arctic Watch, attending workshops, hosting workshops, things like that, trying to get as much community input as possible. And I think going forward too, again, I'm gonna hammer down on the communication aspect. I think there's a big lack of communication. Like there's so many things happening in the region, happening across the Arctic, and so many different research projects, so many different universities, so many different consortium. There's just that lack of communication. I'm not really sure how to bridge that gap 100%. But doing things such as like this presentation is definitely, I think, a step in the right direction to kind of, communicate with as many people as possible.
I think the best people you would want to work with, you, let's say you couldn't contact directly with the tribal community. You know, there's people out there. I know I mentioned consortiums, but Gay Sheffield works with a lot of the coastal villages. So she would, you know, she's familiar with a lot of faces and people who, you know, she knows people in communities that, you know, have a lot of knowledge and can be very helpful. So, you know, I would trust Gay to give information.
Well, thanks, Opic, but it's really, I appreciate that, but the tribes have the voice, that's a sovereign government. You guys are sovereign,
No. I meant if she was trying to find the right tribal person to connect with.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Where to, yeah.
Like let's say somebody told her to contact with Pat Umiak, you know, but he's not here. So, you know, then Gay would say, oh no, you can't do that. He's no longer on
Call the
Earth.
real number. Call the number
Yep.
for the tribal office. Yeah, that's the best
Yeah.
place to start. Thank you for that, Opic. That's a good reminder to everybody and the researchers.
Yep.
All right. Are you good, Opic? You have any thoughts?
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. All right. In the chat, there's Rob Kaler again, and he says, thanks, Bella. Could your data be used in a risk analysis based on how vessels are powered? Specifically, I am concerned about nuclear powered vessels. Look, hang on. Nuclear powered vessels that might ground and a lack of how to respond to an incident. Now, these long ones are tough. Would your analyses help inform policy with regard to informed planning? And I'll just throw in there, while Rob is worried about a nuclear accident, we just had a, I don't know, 400-foot crude oil tanker go northbound first week of December through the strait. So I will add a full, heading from China back to Murmansk, a fuel tanker with crude oil in that scenario too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern about nuclear powered vessels, increased LNG tankers, crude oil tankers, going through the strait, particularly because it is pretty hazardous in a lot of areas with very shallow waters in comparison to the size of these ships. I think one of the benefits of the research that I'm doing is that you could potentially use it for risk analysis and looking at where different policies can be used for planning, including like the areas to be avoided, as well as the aspect of a vessel monitoring system, things like that. I would like to go more into risk analysis, looking at like different things such as like bathymetry compared to vessel traffic and things like that for that planning process.
All right. Does that answer that, Rob? You good?
Amazing. Thank you so much. And my audio has been really poor these last, yeah, you probably can't hear me, but
We
thank you,
can.
Gabe, for translating
Yeah.
my questions.
We can hear you, and I hope I get them right.
You did well.
All right. Any other questions right away or in the chat? I do have another one, but it's kind of a small one, and it could be my confusion. On your slides of the distribution, you had mentioned that it was interesting, the more southern communities. I think you had those more southern communities from the YK Delta get the boats later, right? You were wondering about, was that something you were wondering about, why those trips go later for them in the season?
So actually reverse, they're receiving them early, like in spring versus summer or fall, such as like so you can assume that the vessels are going south to north. And so just looking at like that seasonal distribution, it'll be interesting to see how that changes as sea ice continues to retreat faster.
Well, that'll be interesting because I stand corrected, but I was thinking that, we have the barges come to Nome and then the cargo comes off the really large barges. So you may have very few vessels, but they'd be quite large, and they're dropping off a cargo load all over our docks and things like that in the port. Then we get the smaller boats that come up that go up rivers. And a lot of times the ice is hanging in those river mouths, or, it takes longer for them to get, because they have to wait for the cargo to get offloaded in Nome and then go into smaller river type or shallow draft cargo vessels. And then off they go and start hitting that up. So that's interesting to me. That's opposite of what I would have thought, but all right. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Nome still does get some in the late spring. But yeah, I would really like to take the cargo and put it in conjunction with the tug to see if things are different. Maybe there's more activity from those few ships that are arriving in Nome. Those are the bigger ones you're talking about that maybe are connecting with the smaller ones, and so it kind of will change that distribution.
Yeah, because the big ones need a tug, right? They're just a big barge. And then the smaller river craft are not typically barged up. They can be, but for the most part, they're going to the YK Delta or, up Kotzebue Way or wherever.
Yeah.
If that helps. Something to think about anyway. But it's kind of esoteric, but something to think about. All right. Any other questions? Comments, thoughts? All right. Well, thank you so much. And I know that your coworkers put their information in the chat as well. If anyone's interested in learning more about what the other aspects of it's all under the Arctic Telecoupling Project. So if people want to learn more, I see on your slide there, you've got the National Science Foundation funded number. You can find more about that if you write that down and then Google that under NSF project number, and there'll be lots of information as well.
Yeah, and we do also have a website that has a lot of that NSF information that's moved over to our website, so it's a little bit easier to find. It's arctictelecoupling.org. We're currently in the process of revamping the website, but there's a lot of really, really interesting information, story maps, things like that. So,
all right. With that, I guess we'll, any other questions, comments, thoughts, or kudos? With that, oh, there's always one. My screen lit up. Hang on, Bella. Oh, here we go. Oh, you've just got a lot of fan mail, so that's really lovely. Well done. And with that, next week, we will close out the 2024 Straight Science season with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game results on their muskox movement study for the Seward Peninsula and beyond into the Northeast, because I think that's not a spoiler, but I think the animals are expanding their range. That'll be on the Wednesday, not tonight, we're not a Thursday night, Wednesday the 18th. And that's a long-term, multi-year study locally done here. So that'll be of great interest to all of us as to where the musk oxen are traveling to and their range movements, things like that. So we'll see you then next week. Bella and any of your team, or Bella, I guess, if you want to stay on after and we let everyone go, that would be awesome, just for a few minutes. And have a good night, everyone. We'll see you on the 18th to learn more about our local muskox. With that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.